What if I told you that foreign aid, the money that's supposed to help struggling countries, can actually trap them in deeper debt, strip them of sovereignty, and keep them under the thumb of global powers? This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's the hidden playbook of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. And once you see how it works, you'll never look at global aid the same way again. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was born in 1944 at the famous Bretton Woods Conference, the same event that created the World Bank and cemented the US dollar as the backbone of the global financial system. Its original mission was clear: prevent another Great Depression, stabilize currencies, and give countries a safety net when they face economic crisis. In other words, it was supposed to be the financial firefighter of the world, rushing in with emergency loans whenever economies went up in flames. At first glance, it seems like a noble institution. When a country runs out of money, who wouldn't want a helping hand? The IMF presents itself as that lifeline, an international community pooling resources to ensure stability and prosperity for all. But behind this mission statement lies a more complicated reality. The IMF isn't just a neutral lender. Its funding comes from its member states, and voting power is distributed based on contributions. That means the largest economies, especially the United States and European powers, hold the most influence over its decisions. For example, the US alone has an effective veto over major IMF policies. So right away, the idea of the IMF as a global safety net comes into question. Who decides the terms of this aid? Who really benefits? And why do so many developing countries end up worse off after IMF intervention than before? To understand the IMF's playbook, we need to zoom out. Think of it this way: the IMF doesn't just hand out cash, it writes the rules of the game. Every loan comes with conditions, and those conditions reshape entire economies. Industries, trade policies, even social safety nets can all be restructured to fit a model that critics argue favors creditors, multinational corporations, and powerful governments, not the people living inside those countries. So while the IMF presents itself as a doctor treating sick economies, many argue that it's more like a surgeon who uses the same scalpel every time, regardless of the patient, cutting deeper, demanding more sacrifices, and leaving scars that can last generations. Today, we're going to break down exactly how this system works, how aid becomes a weapon, and how crises turn into opportunities, and why countries like Jamaica, Argentina, and Greece became case studies in what some call debt colonialism. Once you see the patterns, you'll understand why so many nations fear turning to the IMF, even when they're desperate. So how exactly does the IMF turn financial aid into a tool of control? The process is rarely about a one-time loan. Instead, it unfolds like a carefully rehearsed playbook. It begins when a country runs into economic trouble. Maybe its currency collapses, inflation skyrockets, or debt payments spiral out of control. These crises often come after years of unsustainable borrowing, corruption, or external shocks like oil price spikes. But once the country is desperate for cash, the IMF steps in as the so-called lender of last resort. This is where the IMF distinguishes itself from a normal bank. It doesn't just hand over money, it attaches strings, called structural adjustment programs. These can include requirements to cut government spending, privatize state-owned industries, lift subsidies, open up markets to foreign competition, and raise interest rates. In theory, these reforms are designed to stabilize the economy and restore investor confidence. But in practice, these policies often hit ordinary people hardest. Cutting subsidies can make food and fuel unaffordable. Privatizing public services can put them in the hands of foreign corporations. And austerity, the push to slash government spending, can mean fewer hospitals, fewer schools, and fewer jobs. The country gets the loans, but the people pay the price. Here's the trap. These conditions rarely fix the root problems overnight. Instead, economies often shrink under the weight of austerity. That means less tax revenue, which makes it even harder to pay off debt. And so the country goes back to the IMF for another loan, often to pay off the previous one. A cycle of dependency is born, where nations find themselves locked into decades of IMF oversight. With this dependency comes leverage. The IMF doesn't just shape domestic policies, it also influences foreign policy. Because its largest shareholders, the US and Japan powers, hold the most sway. Loans can be granted or withheld based on geopolitical interests. Countries that align with Western powers might find the IMF more generous. Those that resist might find their aid delayed, reduced, or canceled altogether. This is why critics call the IMF a tool of soft power. It doesn't conquer nations with armies, but with balance sheets. Instead of boots on the ground, it's contracts and conditions that realign a country's economy with global markets, usually in ways that benefits creditors, corporations, and the geopolitical goals of the West. Once the dust settles, the IMF's fingerprints are everywhere. Entire industries may have been sold off to foreign investors. Trade policies may have been rewritten to favor imports over local production. Labor markets may have been deregulated to make workers more competitive, often meaning cheaper. By the time the program ends, the economy might be more stable in technical terms, but more vulnerable, unequal, and dependent in human terms. This cycle is played out again and again, from Latin America in the 1980s debt crisis to Africa in the 1990s to Europe after the 2008 financial crash. Different countries, different crises, but the same playbook. In the 1970s, Jamaica faced mounting debt and collapsing currency. The IMF stepped in with loans, but they came with strict conditions. The government was told to cut subsidies on food and fuel, devalue its currency, and open its markets to foreign imports. On paper, these were reforms to stabilize the economy. But in practice, Jamaican farmers suddenly had to compete with cheap imported goods, often heavily subsidized by the U.S. The result? Local industries crumbled, unemployment soared, and ordinary Jamaicans faced skyrocketing prices. By the mid 1980s, debt payments consumed more than half of Jamaica's export earnings. The country had effectively become locked in a cycle: borrow, cut, pay, repeat. Protests broke out across the island. People marched against food shortages, job losses, and IMF austerity. Yet, despite decades of adjustment programs, Jamaica's debt burden lingered for more than 30 years. The IMF's medicine left deep scars, and the nation's growth never fully recovered. Few countries embody the IMF cycle of dependency like Argentina. In the 1990s, Argentina adopted IMF-backed reforms, privatizing state industries, pegging its currency to the US dollar, and slashing public spending. At first, the reforms were hailed as a success. Inflation dropped, foreign investors poured in, and the IMF held Argentina up as a model. But beneath the surface, debt piled up and unemployment soared. By 2001, the House of Cards collapsed. The government defaulted on $132 billion, the largest sovereign default in history at the time. The peso lost three-quarters of its value, banks froze withdrawals, and riots filled the streets. Millions of Argentines fell into poverty almost overnight. And yet, instead of escaping IMF's grip, Argentina returned to it. In 2018, the IMF approved a record 57 billion bailout, the largest in its history. Once again, austerity measures were demanded, and once again, ordinary Argentinians carried the burden. Even wealthy Europe wasn't spared from the IMF playbook. After the 2008 financial crash, Greece was left with massive debts and a crippled banking system. In 2010, it turned to the IMF and the European Union for help. The bailout came with brutal conditions: slashing pensions, cutting government jobs, raising taxes, and privatizing assets. Greek citizens suddenly found themselves paying more for less. Higher taxes, but shrinking services, fewer jobs, and collapsing wages. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment soared above 60%. An entire generation saw its future erased. Mass protests and strikes erupted across Athens. Images of riot police clashing with demonstrators spread across the world, symbolizing the human cost of austerity. Despite all the sacrifices, Greece's debt to GDP ratio actually increased. While ordinary Greeks suffered, foreign banks and investors were shielded from losses. To critics, Greece had become a modern debt colony, its policies dictated not from Athens, but from Washington, Brussels, and Frankfurt. To understand how the IMF really works, you don't just listen to politicians. You listen to the insiders, the economists, and even the whistleblowers who've seen it up close. Take Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winning economist and former chief economist of the World Bank. He once called IMF policies a one size fits all disaster, arguing that austerity measures consistently crush growth and devastate the poor. In his words, the IMF was not created to save countries, it was created to save creditors. Then there's John Perkins, author of The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He describes a shadowy world where international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are used as tools of empire. According to Perkins, loans are designed to be unpayable. Once a country defaults, it's forced to sell off its resources, open its markets, and hand over political leverage. Even within the IMF itself, cracks have appeared. In 2013, the fund admitted it had underestimated the damage austerity would cause in Greece. But by the time this confession was made, Greek society had already been gutted. Mass unemployment, pension cuts, suicides linked to economic despair. The apology came too late. Former IMF officials have quietly admitted that political pressure often shapes lending decisions more than economic logic. Countries strategically import to powerful member states like the US or major European economies often receive more favorable terms. Meanwhile, smaller or less strategic nations get hit with the harshest medicine. Critics also point to the IMF's revolving door. Top IMF officials often move into positions in global banks, hedge funds, or corporate boards, the very institutions that profit from the debt deals. The watchdog becomes the partner. And it's not just economists raising alarms. Grassroots voices, from farmers in Jamaica to union leaders in Argentina to pensioners in Greece, tell a consistent story. IMF loans may keep a government solvent, but they often leave society shattered. These insights reveal a pattern. The IMF presents itself as a neutral doctor prescribing cures, but behind the white coat is a banker ensuring the creditors get paid first, no matter the cost to ordinary people. Now let's do what we always do here, follow the money. When the IMF approves a multi-billion-dollar bailout for a struggling nation, most people imagine the money flowing into hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. But here's the truth. The cash almost never reaches the people. Instead, the first stop is debt repayment. The IMF loans are structured so that the government immediately uses the funds to pay off foreign creditors, usually big international banks, hedge funds, or bondholders in New York, London, or Frankfurt. In other words, the money flows in one door and right out the other. Ordinary citizens never touch it. Take Greece. During the Eurozone crisis, more than 90% of the IMF and EU bailout money never stayed in Greece. It went straight to pay off the German and French banks, covering their risky bets. Greeks were left with deeper debt, soaring unemployment, and gutted pensions, while bankers in Frankfurt and Paris quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Next stop, structural reforms. Governments desperate for IMF loans are forced to privatize state assets, electricity grids, water systems, oil reserves, even farmland. Who buys them? Foreign corporations, often at fire sale prices. The money flows out again, this time in the form of profits for multinational firms. Then there's the consultant and legal industry. IMF programs require countries to hire Western consultants, auditors, and law firms to manage reforms. Millions of dollars in fees flows to firms in Washington, London, or New York, not to local experts. And finally, the most hidden trail, political influence. By keeping countries in cycles of debt and conditional aid, the IMF ensures they align with the strategic goals of its most powerful members. Voting at the United Nations, trade policy, even military cooperations can all be influenced by financial dependency. Money becomes leverage, and leverage becomes control. So let's be clear. IMF loans don't just stabilize economies, they transfer wealth upward and outward, from taxpayers and poor nations to creditors and corporations and rich ones. Every crisis becomes an opportunity to funnel money out of the hands of the vulnerable and into the accounts of the powerful. When you follow the trail, the pattern is undeniable. The IMF is less a rescue squad and more a collection agency for the global elite. So, what happens when the IMF playbook is carried out? The impacts are far reaching, not just in balance sheets, but in people's lives. First, there's the human toll of austerity. When governments slash spending to meet IMF demands, it meets It means cuts to healthcare, education, pensions, and wages. In Jamaica during the 2010s, austerity measures led to hospitals running short of basic supplies, teachers leaving the profession in droves, and young people migrating in search of opportunities abroad. The debt shrank on paper, but the cost was borne by ordinary Jamaicans. Second, there's the loss of sovereignty. When a nation's economic policies are dictated not by its elected officials, but by the technocrats in Washington, D.C., democracy itself takes a hit. Citizens might vote for change, but IMF condition lock government into policies that often run directly against the will of the people. In effect, the ballot box is overwritten by the bailout. Third, IMF programs create dependency cycles. Because the loans prioritize repaying foreign creditors, countries rarely escape debt. Instead, they take new IMF loans to pay off the old ones. Argentina is a textbook case. It has taken more than 20 IMF agreements since the 1950s, yet remain in recurring debt crisis. Each bailout only kicks the can down the road while cementing dependency. Fourth, there's geopolitical leverage. Countries that rely on IMF loans often find themselves aligning with the foreign policy interests of the U.S. and its allies, who hold the largest voting power inside the IMF. This isn't just about economics, it's about shaping global alliances, military cooperation, and trade policy. Financial aid becomes a subtle but powerful weapon of control. And finally, the psychological impact. Nations under constant IMF programs often develop a sense of hopelessness and distrust toward both their governments and international institutions. Citizens see sacrifices demanded year after year, yet little improvement in their daily lives. This erodes faith in democracy and leaves a space for populist or authoritarian leaders to rise by promising to break free from the cycle. So the impact is multi-layered: economic pain, political subordination, social unrest, and strategic control. For the elites, it's a winning formula. For everyday people, it's a trap that shapes not just their present, but the future of entire generations. So, what do you take away from all of this? First, IMF isn't just a financial institution, it's a geopolitical tool. Behind every loan agreement lies not just economic policy, but power, influence, and leverage over entire nations. Second, the so called rescue packages often benefit creditors and corporations more than citizens. The money that flows in during a bailout doesn't stay to build hospitals, roads, or schools. It often flows right back out to international banks, hedge funds, and investors who profit from crisis. Third, the IMF's conditions don't just fix problems, they reshape societies. By enforcing austerity, privatization, and deregulation, the fund rewrites economic rules to favor foreign capital while weakening local control. Nations emerge with a smaller safety net, fewer protections, and a more fragile economy, even if the debt number looks cleaner on paper. Fourth, the cycle rarely ends. Countries that enter the IMF's orbit often find themselves trapped in a revolving door of debt and dependency, returning again and again for bailouts that never solve the underlying issues. And finally, the big picture: the IMF is a window into how the global financial system operates. Crises aren't just accidents, they're opportunities. For the powerful, they're a chance to extract wealth, consolidate control, and rewrite the rules. For everyone else, they're a reminder that the game is stacked from the start. The IMF playbook is clear. Financial aid isn't just money, it's a weapon. And unless nations find ways to resist or rewrite the rules, the cycle will continue, shaping the future of entire generations. What do you think? Is the IMF a lifeline for struggling countries or a weapon used by the powerful to control the weak? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more deep dives like this. And remember, if you want to know who really runs the world, always follow the money.